Hello, and thanks for listening to this webinar on adjusting asphalt concrete mix designs to optimize laboratory performance. My name is Don Christensen, and I'm a senior engineer for Advanced Asphalt Technologies, LLC. And this webinar is part of a Federal Highway Administration program, development and deployment of innovative asphalt pavement technologies in cooperation with the University of Nevada, Reno. This is a legal notice. I'm not going to read it to you, but I will give you a little bit of time so that you can read it if you'd like to. This is another legal slide, one that I put together myself to point out that the research results, findings, and conclusions I'm presenting here are my own thoughts and don't necessarily reflect the position or policies of the various sponsors involved, including the NCHRP, the Wisconsin Highway Research Program, and the FHWA. The purpose of this webinar is to give the participants some practical methods for improving cracking resistance, rutting resistance, and permeability as measured by various laboratory tests. I'm going to go through a few introductory slides and then talk about cracking, rutting, and permeability and how we can improve mixture performance in these three categories. And I'll finish off with a few summary comments. The information being presented in this webinar was based on a variety of research projects done over the past 10 to 15 years. The most recent of these projects was sponsored by the Wisconsin Highway Research Program, or WHRP, and involved research on interlayer mix designs. Specifically, we were trying to determine if there was a simple way of specifying the fatigue performance of these mixes by just using binder tests and simple mixture tests. In this case, we ended up using the ideal CT. The second project listed here involved using the semicircular bend test to characterize the fatigue performance of a wide range of mixtures. And these mixtures were chosen from the mixtures tested as part of NCHRP 959. Details on that project can be found in the report 982. Details on the research done by Christensen and Solomon on the relationship between the SCB test and fatigue performance can be found in Asphalt Pavement Technology, the 2020 volume. Third project listed here involved development and refinement of the rutting resistivity model. This is a model that can be used to estimate the rut resistance of mixtures just based on the mixture composition, volumetrics, and the binder properties. The results of this research can be found in the final report from the Asphalt Research Consortium. You can find this on the University of Nevada website, where there is a section on the Asphalt Research Consortium work. You can also find a paper on this topic in the Transportation Research Record number 2505, published in 2015. The fourth project listed here involved research on permeability, and again, this was part of the Asphalt Research Consortium, and some of the details there can be found on the UNR website. You can also find a paper on this topic in that same Transportation Research Record number 2505. Now, the final projects I've listed here are sort of background information on mix design and volumetrics. A lot of the work in these projects done above were based on what was done in these three projects. The first of these was NCHRP 925-931, in which the results can be found in NCHRP report 567. The second of these is NCHRP 933, documented in NCHRP report 673. This last project involved development of a mix design manual for hot mix concrete, You can download both that final report and the mix design manual from the internet pretty easily. In all the research projects I mentioned in the previous slide, the general approach was similar. What we were trying to do was develop models for laboratory performance tests, and in some cases field performance, based on binder properties, aggregate properties, and mixture volumetrics. We were trying to understand how these factors affect various aspects of pavement performance, including fatigue resistance, rutting resistance, and permeability. The idea here was that we could use these models then to provide some guidance during the mix design process and how to produce mixes that can meet performance tests. It's important to point out that the models developed in these various research projects were not meant to be used within the context of specifications. Instead, they were designed to provide information and guidance needed to make mixtures that would meet performance-related requirements. These models are more effective in predicting how changes in a mix will affect performance, instead of predicting the absolute performance of a mixture. This has become increasingly important as agencies implement simple performance tests and balanced mix designs. In this section of the webinar, I'm going to talk about two mixture tests meant to characterize cracking and fatigue resistance. The first of these is the ideal CT test, which was developed at Texas A&M University. The second test is the semicircular band or SCB test. There are two versions of this test that are widely used. One of them was developed at the University of Illinois and is called the IFIT test. The other one was developed at the Louisiana Transportation Research Center. In this webinar, I'll be focusing on the University of Illinois or IFIT version of the SCB. First, a few general observations on how we might improve the fatigue and cracking resistance of asphalt mixtures. One of the most effective ways to improve fatigue performance is to decrease the binder modulus. This is often going to mean using a lower low temperature PG grade. For instance, going from a PG 6422 to a PG 6428. Using a polymer modified binder, if you aren't already doing so, will also greatly improve your fatigue resistance. If you're already using a polymer modified binder, finding one with a higher elastic recovery can also result in improved fatigue and cracking performance. A fourth method for improving fatigue resistance is to increase your binder content. Now in this webinar, I often use the term cracking resistance to mean the resistance fatigue and other forms of cracking is indicated by simple laboratory tests. I've used cracking resistance rather than fatigue resistance because I'm specifically here talking about simple performance tests that generally involve failure through cracking and monotonic loading of various types of specimens, indirect tension, or that semicircular bend test. I wanted to point out here that when we talk about tests like the ideal CT or the SCB, we're talking about surrogate tests for fatigue performance. I think it's important to realize that these tests are not necessarily 100% accurate. So if you're designing a mixture to pass one of these tests, it usually should show pretty good fatigue resistance, but not always. The tests are not completely reliable, and you should keep this in mind. I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about the ideal CT test and how we might optimize the results of that test during our mix design process. The project that I'm relying on here for data, other information, is that WHRP project on interlayer mix design. This slide shows a summary of the binders used in that project. We used a fairly wide range of binders. Most of these were of the sort you would find in Wisconsin and Minnesota, 58, 28s, 58, 34s. We did throw in one stiffer binder 70-28 is kind of a way to look and make sure that the results were robust and would apply to a wide range of binders. You see the delta TC values there, they all are positive and relatively high. We didn't have really any bad delta TC values. Elastic recoveries, again, they're all pretty high except for that 58S28, which was not polymer modified. Now, this wasn't a binder you would use in an IMD, but we put it in there, again, as a control and to make sure that the results of the research were robust and applicable to a wide range of materials. I want to talk a little bit about that last column there, the massacre excess recovery. And what I mean by that is the recovery in excess of the minimum value given in the appendix of AASHTO M332. That's a minimum value for elastomerically modified binders. And the excess over that we found was a good indication of how effective a polymer modified binder was and giving you enhanced fatigue performance. I should point out here that Greg Harder of the Asphalt Institute has also been talking about this in some of his presentations recently, and I believe he calls this the X factor. And as far as I can determine from talking to some people who have heard his talks, it is pretty much the same thing as what I'm calling excess recovery. These are the 4 aggregates that were used in the WHRP project. These were mixtures using a relatively small sized aggregate, 9.5 millimeter for 2 of the mixes, 4.75 for the other 2. Very high asphalt contents, very high VMA, and air voids at 2%, which is on the low side. Again, these were special purpose mixes intended to have extremely high fatigue resistance. These were designed to be placed mostly between Portland cement concrete pavement and an asphalt concrete overlay. This plot shows the results of a model we put together for predicting CT index for those Wisconsin IMD mixtures. We used 2 predictors here. One of them was a binder modulus and the other was the excess elastic recovery. And the significance of this model is that it does show you that you can use binder properties to pretty accurately predict your CT index. I mentioned earlier that one of the best ways to improve cracking performance is to lower binder modulus, and that's what we saw in this research when we looked at the CT index. This shows relative CT index as a function of binder modulus at the test temperature and 10 Hertz. You can see here that as the modulus goes down, the CT index improves dramatically. For instance, by cutting the binder modulus in half, we can improve the CT index by 20 to 30%. Now, if you want a lower binder modulus, significantly lower, this is often going to mean using a lower low temperature grate. It's probably the best way to ensure an improved cracking performance in the CT index or other tests. Simply use a lower low temperature grate. So what is the effect of changing excess elastic recovery on the CT index? Well, that's what we've shown here on this plot. And it is a strong effect. If you increase excess elastic recovery by 10%, your relative CT index is going to go up by about 20%. So this is a pretty strong effect. So if you want to increase your CT index, one of the ways you can do this is by looking for a polymer modified binder that has higher excess elastic recovery. We're going to move on now to the SCB test and NCHRP 959. This slide summarizes the properties of the binders we used in NCHRP 959 and in that related SCB research. We had a pretty wide range of binders, some of them polymer modified, some of them not. The ones that were polymer modified used a variety of modifiers. We also included binders that were oxidized. One of them had REOB, and one of them was modified with polyphosphoric acid. It's important to point out here that the binders and we used in this research were heavily aged. The binders were aged for 40 hours in a PAV. The mixtures were aged for 5 days at 95 degrees C using the loose mix oven aging. This slide summarizes the aggregate properties for the mixes we used in the SCB research. It was a 9.5 millimeter Massachusetts granite, and design for the mix was 80, and we tested it at 7% air voids. Binder content was 6% by weight. This slide shows the effect of changing binder modulus on SCB flexibility index. As you decrease binder modulus, flexibility index increases, and the effect is quite strong. If you cut your modulus in half, the flexibility index is going to increase by about 40%. Now in practice, what this is going to mean in your mix design process, if you are having trouble meeting your flexibility index, a good way to improve that would be to find a binder with a lower low temperature grade. I wanted to make a few comments about the results of the 959 research and the SCB research, binder properties and polymer modification. Now, in this research, we saw a relatively weak effect for polymer modification and for things like elastic recovery. However, we think that this was because the binders and mixtures were so heavily aged. Again, 5 days of loose mix aging for the mixture and a 40-hour PAV for the binders. This seems to attenuate the effect of polymer modification. And the fact is, we think that if we would have done this or similar research using less heavily aged binders and mixtures, we would have seen a greater effect for those polymer modified binders. To summarize the results of our research on improving laboratory cracking tests, the first thing to look at is your binder modulus. If you can find a binder with a lower modulus, often meaning a lower low temperature PG grade, that will give you improved cracking resistance and improved fatigue performance. If you're not using a polymer modified binder, changing to one will improve the results of your cracking test. If you're already using a modified binder, look for one with a higher elastic recovery to improve the results of your laboratory cracking test and of field fatigue performance. Now, I haven't said a lot about wrap in the webinar. I will mention this a little bit to make sure that people understand. If you decrease your wrap content, this is normally going to decrease the modulus of the effective binder in the mix, and that's going to improve the results of your cracking test. However, it could also worsen the results of your rutting test, something to keep in mind. The next topic we'll discuss is rutting resistance and rutting tests. The information presented here is based on research that was done initially as part of NCHRP 925, 931, and then later refined as part of the work done under the Asphalt Research Consortium. The research results are summarized in a paper in the Transportation Research Record 2505, published in 2015. This is the same paper mentioned earlier. In fact, there are two related papers in that Transportation Research Record. First, some general observations. If you want to improve the rut resistance of your mixture, there are a couple things you can do. Most importantly, you can go to a binder with a lower JNR. This is probably the most effective way of improving the results of a rutting test. If you have that option, you can increase end design, but often you won't be able to do that. You can also increase the aggregate fines, or if you will, the dust to binder ratio, meaning the amount of material passing the number 200 sieve. And you can also decrease the VMA to increase your rut resistance, although that's something that you often won't be able to do because many mixers are designed at very close to the minimum VMA. So you often can't lower that any further. The resistivity rutting model was originally developed as part of NCHRP projects 925 and 931. It was developed to allow engineers and technicians to predict rutting based upon binder properties and mixture composition. This model was modified a few years later as part of an airfield asphalt pavement technology program project 0402, and that modification involved replacing the original superpave rutting parameter G star over sine delta with the massacre rutting parameter JNR. Additional refinements were done even later as part of the Asphalt Research Consortium, and the model that I'm using here as a basis for these slides was based on that ARC modification. The model is somewhat complicated, and what I'm showing here is a simplified version to make it a little bit easier to understand. I don't want to belabor the mathematics of this model. What I will tell you here is what this shows is that the rutting resistance of a mix is going to increase as end design goes up and as the surface area of the aggregate increases. It's also going to increase as JNR goes down and as the VMA goes down. Now, surface area of the aggregate, this is an important factor here in predicting rutting. It can be a little tricky to measure that or estimate that. So what I've put in here on this simplified model is a way of estimating that based upon the passing 200 material or the mineral filler. And that equation allows you to predict surface area by adding 2.05 to the product, 0.62 times the amount passing the 200 sieve. These were the aggregates and mix designs used in refining the resistivity rutting model. There was a wide range of aggregates used here: limestone, gravel, granite, chert, and diabase from a variety of different states throughout the country. Nominal maximum aggregate size was mostly 9.5 and 12.5 millimeters with one 19 millimeter mix thrown in, and design was 75 in all cases. Asphalt binder contents ranged from 4.9% up to 6.8%. Air voids usually around 7%. There was one mix that had air voids down at around 3%. And we also had a range of VMA values in those mixed designs. And we also had a nice range of binder properties. We had PG grades ranging from 58 up to 82. 3 of these were non-modified. We have 5 polymer modified and 2 that contain polyphosphoric acid. So a nice range of binders. This slide is a summary of the field sections used in the recalibration of the resistivity rutting model. There were 14 sections from the Min-Road project, 26 sections from the 2000 cycle of the NCAT test track, 4 sections from West Track, and 5 sections from Pennsylvania State Route 11. This slide shows the results of the recalibration of the resistivity rutting model. The accuracy of the model, you might think, isn't especially high. It looks like we're only getting predictions that are accurate to within maybe an order of magnitude. However, just the measurement of rutting in these field sections is highly variable. There's an awful lot of variation in those measurements. So this accuracy, given the variability inherent in field rutting measurements, is actually pretty good. I wanted to validate the simplified model I showed a few minutes ago to make sure that version of the resistivity rutting model was in fact reasonably accurate. And I did that by looking at the ALF2 rutting study and predicting the number of passes to a 7.2 millimeter rut depth and comparing that to the resistivity rutting index. And you can see it worked pretty well with an R-squared value of 89%. So it appears that, yes, that simplified model is in fact pretty accurate. And we shouldn't be surprised here at this point to see that the binder properties, in this case GNR, has a very strong effect on the relative rutting life, or the rut resistance. As GNR goes down, the rutting resistance goes up dramatically. If you can cut GNR in half, the rutting life is going to increase by a factor of 2.5. And so that's quite a substantial effect. And this is the first thing you should look at if you're trying to improve the rut resistance of your mixture. Decrease GNR. Go to a higher massacre binder grade. You can also increase rut resistance by increasing end design, but of course you often don't have that option. You're given end design value and you can't change it. But if you can, for instance, increase end design from 50 to 75, it's going to about double your rut life. If you go from 7500, the effect isn't as strong, but it's still there. You'll increase your rutting life by about 60%. This slide shows the effect of changing your aggregate surface area on rutting life. This is a fairly strong effect, something that could be useful if you want to improve the results of a rutting test on your mix. If you can increase the aggregate surface area, for instance, from 5 to 6 square meters per kilogram, you'll see your rutting life improve by about 50%. If you go from 6 to 7 square meters per kilogram, the improvement is a little bit less at 40%. So a lot of you are probably asking, well, what do I have to do to go from, say, 5 to 6 square meters per kilogram in surface area? Well, this would be something you could achieve, for instance, by increasing your mineral filler from 4.8 to 6.4%, which is a 34% increase in your mineral filler. It's significant, but not unreasonable. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to improve your rut resistance. The nice thing about increasing your aggregate surface area or mineral filler content is it won't tend to degrade your cracking resistance. So it's something that's good to look at, especially if you're fairly close to passing that rutting test. As I mentioned before, you're often not going to be able to reduce VMA because mix designs are often set up so that the VMA is just a little bit above the minimum required value. But if you can, lowering VMA will improve your rut resistance. If you can decrease VMA by 1%, your rutting life will go up by about 25%. Now, this isn't a really big effect. It's probably the least effective way of improving your rut resistance. Furthermore, decreasing VMA is often going to mean a lower binder content, which can negatively impact your fatigue and cracking resistance. So I think this is something you probably want to avoid. A few summary comments on improving the rut resistance of your mix. The most important thing you can do is to decrease GNR. Now you want to make sure when you do that you don't increase the low temperature grade of your binder. In a lot of cases, that's going to mean moving from a non-modified to a modified binder, or from a modified binder to one that's more heavily modified. You can also increase your rut resistance by increasing end design, but that usually isn't going to be an option because end design will be specified for the mix. If you're close to passing a rutting test and you just need a relatively minor improvement, a good thing to look at is increasing your aggregate fines. You're passing 200 or mineral filler in that mix. You might have to increase it by 20, 30, 40%, but it will give you a significant jump in your rut resistance. You can also decrease the VMA, but that, like end design, is often not an option because mixes tend to be designed just a little bit above the minimum VMA. I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about some real-life situations in designing mixtures to pass performance tests. There's three situations that I'm going to talk about. A case where your rutting test passes, your cracking fails. Another case where your rutting fails and the cracking test passes. And the situation where both rutting and cracking tests fail. An important concept here is the trade-off that exists between rutting and cracking performance. Typically, if you increase the rutting resistance of a mix, it means making it stiffer. And in the process, you'll increase the rut resistance, but the cracking and fatigue performance are going to decrease. Same thing happens in the reverse case. When you try to improve that cracking resistance, the fatigue performance, you're going to try to make that mix softer. You may get that improvement in crack resistance, but now the rutting resistance is going to go down. A good example of that is what happened when we went from Marshall mix designs to Super Pave mix designs. Those Marshall mix designs in the 1960s, 1970s were pretty good in terms of resisting cracking, but they were notoriously poor in resisting rutting. Now, we addressed that in the Super Pave mixes, but when we first started to implement those, we found that, yeah, they had really good rut resistance, but they tended to crack more than those old Marshall mix designs. Now, we've addressed that to a certain extent, but I'm just using this to illustrate the trade-off there between rutting and cracking performance. So, imagine that our rutting test passes, but our cracking test fails. What can we do to improve the cracking performance that isn't going to significantly impact our rutting performance? Well, the first thing we can do is decrease the binder low temperature grade, making sure that you maintain JNR. For instance, go from a PG 58V28 to a PG 58V34. Another thing we can do if we're looking for a modified binder, we already have a modified binder, say, look for one that has increased elastic recovery. But again, you want to make sure you maintain JNR. By maintaining JNR, we're going to ensure that our rut resistance more or less stays the same. Another way we can improve the cracking resistance is to increase the binder content in VMA. However, we need to make sure while we do that we increase the aggregate fines to make sure we keep our rut resistance. A good rule of thumb there is to try to keep your dust to binder ratio the same. Another thing we can do is decrease wrap, but we got to be careful there because that will also affect your rut resistance. It's going to help you with cracking, but it may decrease your rut resistance. Now what happens in the opposite case? Your rutting test fails, but your cracking test passes. The first thing we want to look at is decreasing your binder JNR without increasing the low temperature binder grade. That is, we want a lower JNR, but we don't want to increase our binder stiffness. We can increase our aggregate fines. This will tend to improve your running resistance without decreasing your fatigue and cracking performance. We could also decrease the VMA. That will help with the rutting, but I wouldn't recommend this. It's not going to give you a huge increase in your rutting performance, and it will tend to decrease your fatigue and cracking performance. If you do manage to modify a mix that has problems with the rutting performance so that it passes the rutting test, but now you have failed a cracking test, you want to look at going to a binder with the same JNR, say, but with a decreased low temperature grade or better elastic recovery. And of course, you can improve rut resistance by using more wrap, but this could cause a problem with cracking, in which case you may find you'll have to lower that binder low temperature grade. Now we have the sad situation where both the rutting and cracking tests fail. What are we going to do now? Well, you want to find a binder that has a lower JNR, say a higher massacre grade, and a lower low temperature grade. For example, if we started out with a 58H28, we'd want to go to a 58B34. So you're both using a binder with a softer modulus at intermediate temperatures and low temperatures, but with an improved performance at high temperatures for rut resistance. We could use a binder with lower JNR, but with a substantially increased elastic recovery. This will also tend to improve both rut resistance and cracking resistance. We could also increase both our VMA and our aggregate fines. But this is probably not going to provide a huge benefit. This is something you might want to try if you're right on the borderline on both the rutting and cracking tests. The last aspect of performance that I'm going to be talking about is permeability. The information I'm presenting here is based on research that was done in a number of different projects, including several NCHRP projects and the Asphalt Research Consortium, which I have mentioned several times previously. You can find a paper on the permeability model and Transportation Research Record number 2505, published in 2015. There's also a very good paper on permeability that was published some time ago, 1998, in the Asphalt Pavement Technology Journal by Chobani and several others from the state of Florida, both the DOT and the University of Florida. I'd highly suggest that you find that paper and read it if you are interested. Some of you might be wondering why I'm talking about permeability in this presentation. It's not really something that is commonly measured or specified at this time, but I think it probably should be. And that's because lower permeability is going to help with both age hardening and moisture damage. It's very important in your surface mixes. The reason it helps with these aspects of performance is because if air and water can't get into your pavement, it minimizes the potential for oxidation and moisture damage. And this is very important in terms of your long-term pavement performance. Lower permeability mixes also tend to show better rut resistance. I think it's possible that in the future some agencies will start specifying permeability, either measured in the laboratory or perhaps estimated from some sort of predictive method. The database that was used to develop the permeability model that we used in this research included a wide range of mixes. There were mixes from Florida, from NCAT, from Kansas, NCHRP Project 927, and mixes that we put together as part of NCHRP Projects 925 and 931. These were mostly field cores, around 300. Some of them were laboratory compacted, and the aggregate sizes ranged from 9.5 millimeters to 25 millimeters. Most of them were 12.5 millimeter mixes. This shows the results of that permeability model in terms of observed permeability and predicted permeability on a log-log scale. Now, this shows a lot of variability. It's only accurate to within about an order of magnitude, say a factor of 10. And this might seem very poor, but you have to keep in mind that if you just looked at measuring permeability on field cores alone, you would see variability close to this. In other words, you're really never going to get a model much better than this because the variability in the measurements is extremely high. And again, I want to point out that the way we're using this model here is to predict how a change in a mixture property component or other aspect of that mix, how is that going to change its permeability? And this model should work pretty well for that purpose. Again, maybe not as good for predicting the absolute permeability of a specific core or specimen, but pretty good in terms of telling you how to improve the permeability of a mixture. So what does this model tell us about how to achieve lower permeability? Well, the first thing I'm going to mention here isn't really part of the mix design process, but it's exceedingly important. And that is you want to keep your in-place air voids low. If your in-place in-place air voids are high, your permeability is in all probability going to be very high. The compaction is so important. I can't overemphasize that. And it's important to understand that. So if you do a mixed design and you think it has pretty low permeability, but it's put in a pavement and they test it and say, well, this isn't good. It has a really high permeability. Well, if you look at the way it was constructed, you'll probably find that the in-place voids were extremely high. And that's the reason the permeability is high. It's not a problem with the mixed design. Okay, so if we want our mixed design to have low permeability, how do we do that? Well, the first thing is to use a finer gradation. Permeability decreases with smaller average aggregate size. That is the D50, meaning the aggregate size, which is medium in the middle of your distribution. It also increases with the larger nominal maximum aggregate size. A good way of looking at this from a practical point of view, if you want to decrease your mixture permeability, increase the percent passing the primary control sieve. What this means is we're going to want to use fine aggregate gradations, or in some cases a gap graded mix, for example SMA. Now if you want to achieve good permeability in a mixed design, how can you go about this? Well, in reality it's pretty simple. Giovanni and his co-authors in their paper suggested a maximum permeability of about 125 times 10 to the negative 5th centimeters per second. If you want to achieve this level of permeability, a good rule of thumb is that if you have in-place air voids of 8%, you want to use an aggregate gradation that passes above the primary control sieve, which means by definition you're going to use a fine gradation or perhaps a gap graded gradation in your mix design. So by doing that, you're going to pretty much ensure that you get reasonably low permeability. But again, I want to emphasize that this will all be for naught if you do not achieve good in-place density. So if you have in-place air voids that are up around 10 or 12%, it's probably not going to matter what kind of mix design you have there. You're going to have high in-place permeability. A good side benefit of achieving low permeability in your mix is it's probably going to help you for rut resistance. Okay, time to wrap things up. I think maybe the most important thing you could take away from this webinar is that the best way to address problems with the results of cracking tests or rutting tests is to look at your binder properties. If you have a problem with your cracking test results, the first thing to look at is your binder modulus. You want to get a binder with a lower modulus. Typically, you get that by going to a low temperature PG grade. If you're not using a polymer modified binder, by moving to this type of material, you can also get substantial improvements in your cracking test. If you're already using a polymer modified binder, try to find one with an increased elastic recovery. Now, if you have a problem with your rutting test, what you need to be looking at is your binder JNR. You want to decrease your JNR. This means using a higher massacre grade, going from an S to an H or from a V to an E. You can improve your rut resistance by decreasing the VMA, but that's usually not possible, and I wouldn't recommend it because it's not going to give you that much benefit, and it's probably going to give you a decrease in your fatigue and cracking performance. Another thing to look at if you want to improve rutting resistance is increasing your mineral filler. This will give you some improvement in the results of your rutting test, not as much as decreasing JNR, but it can give you some benefit. And the nice thing about increasing your mineral filler is it won't tend to decrease your cracking performance. The main thing to remember about getting a mixture with a nice low permeability is that you want an aggregate gradation that passes above the primary control sieve. I would mean using a fine aggregate gradation or perhaps a gap graded aggregate. I've said this many times and I'm going to say it once more because it does bear repeating. It's extremely important. Changing your binder properties represents the biggest opportunity for improving performance test results. You want to increase that massacre grade for better rep resistance. You want to decrease low temperature grade and or polymer modification and increased elastic recovery for cracking resistance. Changing your volumetrics and aggregate gradation can be used for relatively minor improvements in test results, but typically you're not going to see huge improvements in rutting tests and fatigue and cracking tests by changing your volumetrics. Decreasing VMA, increasing fines will tend to improve rut resistance, although you will see a decrease in cracking performance. You can increase the VMA for better cracking performance, but you want to make sure that at the same time you increase the mineral filler to maintain your rut resistance. A good rule of thumb there would be maintain your dust to binder ratio when you're increasing VMA and binder content. We need to also remember that wrap content is going to affect performance. That being said, these guidelines and methods that I've given here for modifying your mix to obtain good performance test results will apply whether or not you have wrap in your mix. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And if you have questions about the webinar, the information I've talked about today, please feel free to email me at dwcaat@hotmail.com. Thanks again.